Well, let's take a look at our Old Testament memes. A meme's a unit of cultural transmission. It's kind of an idea coming out of the Old Testament that they used in the New Testament. And then the writers of the New Testament presumed you already know what that was all about. Well, we don't on some of these. Some we do, but many we don't. So the first week we looked at this meme, this idea of rest, which from the Old Testament is the major theme of salvation. Salvation is all about rest. And so when it's talked about in the Old Testament, it's talked about in terms of rest, which is why it makes sense when Jesus came, he says, "Come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That's actually the theme of salvation, is rest. And what is rest? Ceasing from your works. Salvation has nothing to do about your work. So that's probably the most dominant misunderstanding we have from the themes of the Old Testament. We looked at priests last week, and boy, is there a lot of misconceptions about priests around here. So we looked at priests to understand how it is that we can be in a royal priesthood. Today we're going to look at something, it's kind of hard, but you'll be with it. So here's our whole idea. We keep using these memes from the Old Testament, and I'm not really sure we understand what they are. So these are the ones we're covering this summer, rest and priests. And today we're going to look at Firstborn. So what is Firstborn all about? And how does it apply in the New Testament? This is actually going to be sort of part A of two of these. We'll do Firstborn this week, but next week we're going to do sons and fathers. And those two concepts together give you the fuller picture of it. But I just got to tell you, put on your thinking caps. This week and next week are probably the toughest ones to get your arms around, okay? But the result is incredible. So just keep on your toes. Don't fall asleep. I'll throw things if I see you sleeping. Let's see, what can I throw? Not much. Okay, so I won't throw anything at you. But we'll just take a look. Firstborn has its obvious connection to being the firstborn in the family. But here's what we see in the New Testament, which confuses us. In Colossians 1:15, he says about Jesus, he's the image of the invisible God. Okay, I get that. God is invisible. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So that makes sense. He's perfectly representative of who the Father is. But the next line is what confuses us. It says, he's the firstborn of all creation. I think I don't understand that. If you understand that, then you're way ahead of most of us, because that's just a foreign phrase, you know. If someone walked in the front door who's lived in Brigham City, for instance, their entire life, and everyone knows who this person is, and they're well accomplished, you say, hey, he's the firstborn of Brigham City. Well, what does that mean? So we're going to take a look at that, because the firstborn has a real connotation that we're clearly not understanding in the shorthand here. Later in Colossians, in the same chapter, he's the head of the body, the church, okay? He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Firstborn from the dead. You mean he's the first one who's raised from the dead? Well, actually not, because in Jesus' ministry, people were raised from the dead. So clearly we don't understand this. There's something about this that we're saying, I think I need more info. And by the way, I put an asterisk right there, because this phrase is also used quite famously in the opening of Revelation. When Jesus is there giving the revelation to John, he announces who he is. He's Jesus. He's the firstborn from the dead. So it's used twice in this context. Again, we probably don't get it. So let's see if we can get it today. Here's another place it's used in the New Testament, Hebrews 12. And talking about what our whole process of salvation, coming to the Lord, and what that all entails. And he says, this is what's happened to you. You have come, talking about you who are followers of Jesus, you have come to Mount Zion, and there's a list of and tos, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. You are a part of the assembly of the firstborn in heaven. All of us. So there's now multiple firstborns, and we're included in that. So what does that mean, really? Why didn't he just say, see, this is Jim writing the Bible, and to the assembly of the followers of Jesus who are enrolled in heaven? That would have made me much more comfortable. But he said the firstborn of it. Okay, so we got to check that out. The firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all. And I think there's 2 or 3 and tos after that. He describes in sort of a cosmic sense what it is we've come to as following Jesus. But he says we've come to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. And when you looked at this more carefully, this is all of us, not just a few people. So we got to figure that out. Okay, so let's take a look at the Old Testament. And we'll take a look at the Old Testament and see if it gives us some understanding. Now, this is as easy for you to do as it is for me. What do you do? Well, you look in the Old Testament where the word firstborn is. And again, computer software really helps you a lot. You can say, type in firstborn and say, computer, tell me everywhere where firstborn shows up in the Old Testament. You'll get over 100 references to firstborn. And then you can meticulously pick through them one at a time. Well, I've done that for you. So we're ready to go, okay? But this is all you do. There is a Hebrew word that's used for firstborn every time. It's this word Bechor, and Bechor shows up over and over and over and over. In fact, if you know about Hebrew is largely consonants and the vowels were related later in 900 AD. I mean, people use the same vowels. But this BKR word shows up as the root of a lot of words in the Old Testament. Not only firstborn, but first fruits, first of everything that is produced. So this is the idea that comes up. It means first in a real sense. So let's take a look at some of these and see if we can kind of figure out what this means in the New Testament. So I go back to Genesis 49. The scene is the end of Jacob's life. And at the end of Jacob, now named Israel, at the end of his life, he's actually giving a prophetic blessing to his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And he's giving a prophetic blessing. It's a fascinating section, by the way, if you've never read it. To see the father tell the 12 sons what's going to become of them is a fascinating thing. So I'm going to give you one of them right here. Jacob called his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. So it's clearly prophetic. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father. That's his new name, is now Israel after he wrestled with God instead of Jacob. Okay, so listen, and here's how he starts off. He starts off with his oldest, Reuben, you are my firstborn. So what does firstborn mean there? First kid. So that's actually an okay way to look at it. But you have to understand that in ancient times, the first kid, especially the first son, had a special position. And so Reuben, he's saying, Reuben, you're my firstborn. Now look at the privilege that comes to Reuben. See, we got two kids, Reuben and Simeon, Levi, and so there's a number one and a number two. So that's really all we're talking about here. We're talking about the firstborn in that sense. He goes on and says to Reuben, my might and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity, preeminent in power. That's a good capsulization of what the honor is given to the firstborn son. He is preeminent in dignity and power. He's the representation of the might of the Father, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, the first thing that the Father produces. So the firstborn has this great honor of preeminence. Actually, and the preeminence just means the first to arrive on the scene, but it's more than that. The son himself has kind of this honor and chiefness that the other sons and kids will never have. You see that? So that's what he's saying right here. We're going to come back to this passage later on, because then after that, Israel says something crazy about Reuben. But I just wanted to show you it can be used in the common sense. Now, if you go a little farther into Exodus, when the Israelites are leaving Egypt, God's instructing Moses, and he says to Moses, this is your message to Pharaoh. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. All of Israel is my firstborn son. Well, that's kind of interesting. And then he goes on and says, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. He's my firstborn son. So in a real sense, when he uses firstborn with Israel right here, he's saying that this firstborn son, like, remember what Israel says to Reuben, my might is here, and the purposes I have planned for my life extended for you are here. God's saying that about all of Israel. Israel is like a firstborn son to God himself, where this firstborn son represents the power and the might and the purpose of the Father. And that's what he's saying here. Which is why, by the way, remember the nastiest of the plagues that visited Egypt? The death of the firstborns. And why? If you refuse to let him go, behold, I'll kill your firstborn son. Now you got to remember, at this time when Moses is talking to Pharaoh, Israel has been in captivity as slaves for 4 centuries. They've been there. And after those 4 centuries, Egypt and the Pharaoh tends to think these Israelites who are living amongst us, who are they? They serve us, the Egyptians. They're slaves. They serve us. And God's coming back to Pharaoh and saying, no. They don't serve you. They serve me. They're my firstborn, not your firstborn. And if you refuse to let go of my firstborn, I'll take it out on your firstborn. So that's why you have it as part of the plagues. So let me just summarize this a little bit. Well, let me give you one more. Jeremiah 2. Because when you go back to this Exodus 4 thing, he says, you need to let them go that they may serve me. He's not talking in terms of like slaves. He's just talking in terms of the fact that the firstborn in the family really embodies the service to the father. What the father's all about, the firstborn son picks it up. So the service isn't a slave service, and that's why I wanted to show you this in Jeremiah. He says in Jeremiah 2, is Israel a slave? He asks rhetorically. Is he a homeborn servant? Rhetorically. Why then has he become a prey? And then later on in Jeremiah, he says, for I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim, which is a code word for the northern kingdom, is my firstborn. So he's telling Pharaoh back in Exodus, free them because they're not your servants. They're my firstborn. They are the representation of what I am all about on earth right now as my firstborn. My might is in them. My purposes through the entire earth is done through them as my firstborn. They are not your slaves. They're my firstborn. But they're not my slaves either. They serve in a sense because they have picked up all the essential characteristics of God himself. And God, like Jacob and Reuben, God with Israel is saying, I want them to serve me wholly in everything that I'm all about. And they're going to do that. So they're not your slaves. In a sense, they're the extension of my purposes. So here's my thinking lady who's going to think about this. Okay, firstborn, what you can take from that, and I left out a ton of verses. I hope those are illustrative enough. The firstborn is really the embodiment of the Father's purpose and his ongoing work. So with Israel in Egypt, Israel's purpose wasn't to further the economy of Egypt as slaves. Israel's purpose by God's design was to let the world know who this God is as a firstborn, as the one who basically represents totally. So they're actually the embodiment of what the Father was all about to start with, but in the flesh. Okay, so that's the firstborn. The firstborn in every ancient society during that time, the firstborn had put on them this expectation that if dad had a business, if dad was a blacksmith or something like that, then the firstborn would become the blacksmith. And the rest of the kids could sort of do whatever way they wanted to do. But whatever was established by the dad would be fully embodied in that first son. They would pick up the job after that. So in a sense, while both the father and the firstborn was alive, the firstborn fully represented the father's purposes and the father's goals and the father's resources in everything. It was really a perfect representation. The rest of the kids, they can do whatever they want, you know. So if you have a whole passel of kids, if you got 12 kids, like Jacob had 12 kids, you could say to one of them, firstborn, I need you to carry on the family business, but the rest of you can kind of do whatever you want. And in order to help fuel economically the firstborn's responsibility to carry on dad's business, the firstborn was then given a double inheritance compared to everybody else. So let's see if you can do the math. Here we go. What if there's only 2 kids? Okay, then how much of the entire inheritance goes to the firstborn? 2/3. But there's only 2 kids. Why are there 3? Well, they get twice as much. If the first one gets twice as much and the second one gets 1, that means the total is 3. So the first one gets 2/3 and the other one gets 1/3. Get that? What about the 12 sons of Israel? We're going to extend this math. This is like the worst word problems you've had in algebra in elementary school, right? Okay, so let's say there's 12 sons. Reuben, who's the oldest, gets what percentage in a fraction of all the inheritance?
2/13.
Wow, you must be a teacher. 2/13. Okay, never mind. Okay, so you see they would get double. They did double the inheritance. That was so they could carry on the father's business, is what it was. So that was what that was all about. So they are really not just their own. They are wholly given to the purposes of the Father. Wholly given to the purposes of the Father. And I didn't have time to include another part of this, but the Levites, when Israel comes into the land, and the tribe of the Levites, Levi is the 3rd son of Jacob, the Levites were set aside to be the firstborn sons, representing the firstborn sons of all of Israel. So that's why they didn't get an allotment of inheritance in the land, right? So, and in fact, we'll get to it in a second, but in fact, do you know who eventually inherited the firstborn rights in the family of Jacob, in the 12 tribes? It wasn't Reuben. It was actually Joseph, who's the second youngest. There's only one younger than him. And in the allocation of lands, the tribes, when they actually took over land in Israel and stuff like that, you will not see a boundary area for Joseph, but you will see a boundary area for his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Twice the inheritance that everyone else got. Yeah, isn't this tricky? Okay, well, anyway, we'll get there in a second. Okay, so that purpose. Let's take a look at some other sections. Psalm 89, this is God speaking. I have found David, my servant, with my holy oil. I have anointed him so that my hand shall be established with him. See this close representation between God and David. My arm also shall strengthen him. He shall cry to me, you are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Now, is he the firstborn king? No, but there's something about his preeminence and honor and chiefliness. Can you see that right there? It's a way of saying, I'm going to make David the highest preeminent representation of what a king is. I'll make him my firstborn. So we're using this term firstborn not as first in birth, but in terms of the honor that the firstborn has. And God says, I'm going to give that to David. Now let me ask you, in David was the son of Jesse, and there were a lot of other brothers. Is David the firstborn brother in Jesse's family? He was the youngest. So we're starting to pick up an interesting trend in the Old Testament that firstborns may not be the firstborn, but they're given the honor traditionally in the ancient world of what a firstborn is. Okay, so that's what you got to change your thinking to. It actually means in that sense sort of chief or preeminent. I always like to use the word chief. He's the chief one because I'm going to make him the firstborn. There's other ways in which this chiefliness is used. This is kind of crazy. Job 18:13, he's talking about the impending calamity that's going to come on his friends and others. This calamity, it consumes the parts of his skin, and the firstborn of death consumes his limbs. Wait, the firstborn of death? Well, think of firstborn in this colloquial, this idiom of the chief or the biggest of all, right? So what he's saying is that the biggest of all death, you know what we do today? We call it the mother of all death will consume him. Not the firstborn of all death, the mother of it. Do you know what mother of all death means, right? The mother of it. Mother of usually means the biggest and worst. Well, we applied it to a bomb. That one right there. That was used not too recently in the Middle East. The Moab stands for acronym something different, but everyone calls it the mother of all bombs. So that's actually what this phrase means, this firstborn of death, the mother of all death. It's the biggest, it's the chief, it's the highest and chiefest of all death is what he's talking about. So that's how it's used. It's this chief idea. It's used again in this chief idea in Isaiah 14. It's the characteristics of the firstborn. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety, but I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant I will slay. It's kind of a downer part of Isaiah. But it's the phrase he uses that's interesting. The firstborn of the poor will graze, like animals, like Nebuchadnezzar did. What does firstborn of the poor mean? Does that mean just the firstborn in every family? No. Go back to chief, the chief idea. Okay, the chief, it's like this. They translate it like this. The chief among the sons of the poor will graze. So it means really even the most notable of the poor, the most chiefly of the poor, they will still have to graze on all fours like animals. Even the most notable. So that think of firstborn as the honors that are given to a firstborn in an ancient sense in terms of chiefliness and responsibility and honor and dignity, all that kind of stuff, because that's how he's using it right here, the firstborn of the poor. So secondly, out of about 3 points I'll give you, it's not only the embodiment of the Father's purpose and the Father's work, but it also is the fact that this is chief and preeminent in that work. Okay? So instead of us saying the mother of all, they would say the firstborn of all, blank. That's how firstborn is used. Because again, the firstborn anciently, the first son in the family always had the highest dignity, the highest honor, the might and responsibility to carry on the Father's business. So the firstborn is really the chief worker in these things that the Father's all about. So that's what's thought of. Let me give you one more idea right here. In Jeremiah 31, we read this, I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Okay, but just before that, he says this. Oops, go back. Too much clicking. With weeping they shall come. Now we're talking about Israel that's been hauled off into captivity. With weeping they shall come, and with pleas for mercy I will lead them back. and I will make them walk by brooks of water in a straight path in which they shall not stumble. So again, here's where Israel is taken off into the captivity of foreigners, and they've lost their place in the promised land, But God says, even though they've been jerks to me, God says, I'm still going to be the one that leads them back into this place of promise. So another aspect of the firstborn is a very important aspect, and that's that the inheritance goes to the firstborn. There's an inheritance idea, and what we're seeing right here is the inheritance being spelled out explicitly. Even though they're being bad, I'm going to bring them back, and the inheritance is still there. So there's a firstborn not only represents the Father perfectly in might and power, dignity, and honor, and is the best at what he does, chiefly in that sense, and preeminent in that sense. But there's also this idea that all that the Father has comes to him. And here it is right here. You see the inheritance happening. There's a lot of verses like this in the Old Testament too, but that's a big part of this as well. He inherits from the Father. So not only is the firstborn classically ancient thinking, the embodiment of the Father's purpose, the ongoing work of the Father. He's the chief and preeminent in that work. He's the best at it. He has the highest honor in representing that work. And also he inherits from the Father because he carries on the Father's business, right? So those ideas, now here's where it gets hard for you, so you got to put your thinking cap on here. You got to take all those ideas and squish them together in your head because that's what it's all about. It's the preeminent chiefliness, carrying on of the Father's will and might and purpose, so that, as he says about Israel back in Exodus, so that they are wholly mine, W-H-O-L-Y, wholly mine. They are not doing anything else. In Israel, the tribe of the Levites, Levi, they were set aside as God's firstborn in place of the other firstborn. And God said they are wholly mine. Their entire jobs in life are not to till fields like the rest of you who have land. Their job is to be intercessors for my people in Israel. They were holy gods. So in any sense in the Old Testament, when you see someone called a firstborn, it means that they are wholly given to the purposes of the Father. And they're with honor and dignity and might because of it. They're the complete carryover of what the Father does. Let's do the New Testament application that way. That's enough Old Testament. So let's go back to the verses we looked at the beginning. Colossians 1:15. He's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. How would you rephrase that word based on the fact that you're now an Old Testament scholar in firstborn? The firstborn of all creation. How would you put that another way to capture those ideas? The chief of all creation. Now I got to tell you, there's a lot of false religions that take that first verse and make it foolish. They'll say, well, if he's the firstborn of all creation, he must be the first thing that was ever created. Now, you can just completely dispel that misinterpretation by reading the next two verses in Colossians, because all things came into being through him. He's not a created being. So think of chief. Think of the fact, step back a second. Think of all the universe as the Father starting this effort, with the creation of the universe, the creation of man and stuff like that. And the person who is going to carry forward with his might and dignity and honor and power and representative authority, the one who's going to carry that forward is Jesus himself. And so as a result, he's the firstborn. He's the chief. He's the perfect and powerful representation of what the Father's goal and intention is. Embodied. See that? Because that's what he's talking about. If he's not just an older brother, he is the chief of everything in respect to the universe. He really is, in the metaphorical sense, firstborn. He carries the full purpose of the Father, and he's the embodiment of it. And carries through with it. So that's good. Now, when you jump to Colossians 1:18, how would you retranslate that? He's the head of the body of the church. He's the beginning. The firstborn from the dead. Firstborn of the dead. What do you think? What's another way to say that based on the fact that you're all fully informed now about the Old Testament? He's overcome death. That's a piece of it. So he's bigger than death. He's more chiefly than death itself. Yeah? What else do you think? What do you think, PG?
He has conquered the death.
He has conquered death. So in that sense, he's bigger than that. But now, why not just say the conqueror of death? Why say the firstborn of the dead? Yeah, he was the most prominent. So think of prominence and honor and power and representation of what God's want. See, the problem with mankind, that's you, is that we're all sinners. And the wages of sin is death. So the principal purpose of God with the creation of man is to deal with the problem of death that they brought on themselves because of sin. So who is chief? Who is chief of dealing with the problem of death? There it is. He's the firstborn of the dead. He's the one who took the lead, who took the charge. He's the firstborn of the Father. He's the preeminent one. He said, I am going to be the one that's going to embody the purposes of the Father on the behalf of the dead. That's you. That's all of us. And now we look to him and say, he's the firstborn of the dead. Yeah, Wayne.
Jim, wasn't Christ actually the first resurrection immortality?
To immortality, yeah, he is. He is.
The others
Right.
that he brought back from the dead were still mortal.
They died again. Exactly. So in that sense, he is sort of leading the charge as this firstborn. He's leading the dead into a place where there's eternal life. So just think preeminence and chiefliness, the embodiment, the literal embodiment of the purposes of the Father. That's what a firstborn is. That's what an ancient thinker reads this and goes, oh, I get that. Yeah. So someone who didn't really know what Jesus was all about, but they understood the Old Testament meme about the firstborn sons, would look at that phrase in Colossians 1:18 and say, so you're telling me that the purposes of God and embodied through Jesus is to deal with the issue of death. And they would know that. They'd read that in shorthand and get it. That's how they get it. Let me push on. This is like the PS of the story. This is my question, since you're Old Testament scholars now. When is the story of the firstborn worthy of a saga? I mean, when is the story of a firstborn something that you really want to spend lots of pages talking about? Because it's so intriguing and the plot twists. When is the story of a firstborn a saga? And I'll explain that in just a second. We're going to work our way into it because this is our last thought on this. Let's go back to this Jeremiah 31. Remember, he says that Israel's going to come back to the promised land because God, after all, is a father of Israel, and Ephraim's my firstborn. This whole thing, weeping, they'll come back. Pleas of mercy, I'll lead them back. I'll make them walk by brooks of water straight. So they come back from this being captive to another place, and they come back to a wonderful place finally after they've realized they've been idiots. Does that remind you of any story in the New Testament? Prodigal son. Let's look at the prodigal son just for a split second so you'll understand something about firstborns. So here's prodigal son in the New Testament. It's Luke 15. And you remember this. There's a man that had two sons. And he goes on. Well, you know the story. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that's coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Now, you know how the story ends, right? You read this? The younger goes off. He spends his money prodigally. That's what prodigal means, wastefully. He spends and then he comes back to the father. At the end of the story, who has the rich relationship with the father? The prodigal son. Who doesn't? The firstborn. Bum, bum, bum. So wait a second. You mean the firstborn may not be the firstborn? See what I'm saying? The privileges of the relationship with the Father came to the secondborn in that sense. In reality, for the Jewish hearers of this story, it sounded like it was upside down because after all, the honor and dignity ought to go to the first, the older, not the younger. But the honor and dignity of the story went to the younger. In a real sense, the privileges of the firstborn, the dignity and honor and the embodiment of the Father's will came with this rebellious younger son who finally found. And the older son is standing on the side, with his arms crossed and, yeah, well, I've been here all the time. You never killed a fatted calf for me. And he refuses to participate in the celebration. He is alienated from the Father. In a real sense, if you could stand both these boys back and you didn't know which one was born first, you'd ask yourself, which one displays the dignity, honor, and the purpose of the Father better than the other? They'd say the one who went off, the younger one. So clearly, here's what I'm getting at. The first birth may not be the firstborn. The firstborn embodies the purposes of the Father. And the younger one in this story does, not the older. Now, let me tell you something. That's worthy of a saga. That story turned the Jews upside down when they heard it because this eldest was not served honor in that story. The youngest was. But this is a theme. It's topsy-turvy world for us. Because as I went back, when's the story of the firstborn worthy of a saga? Well, when the firstborn is not born first. And in the Old Testament, the honor and dignity of the firstborn is seldom the one that's born first. It's like it goes against the ancient traditions of the firstborn, and it turns itself upside down. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is really, really cool. When the firstborn is not born first, so I started making a list, like Abel over Cain. Cain, yeah, remember Cain and Abel? Abel's given the honor, but he's not the firstborn. How about Jacob over Esau? Esau was born first, but Jacob is the one who acts like the firstborn. Why does he act like the firstborn? Well, just to see it kind of quickly, Jacob is a scallywag. That's my best word for Jacob. Early in his life, he's a deceiver. He's a controller. He's a bad guy in many respects. But his name is changed to Israel, and the 12 tribes come from him. Go figure. But what Jacob had going for him against his brother Esau is that Jacob believed in the inheritance coming from his father Isaac, which was the promise of life with God. He believed in all the issues that are embodied in the firstborn. He was going to be the full embodiment of the promise that came to his father, and he was going to carry it forward. That's the birthright thing. So Jacob ends up acting like the firstborn because he embodies all the values and purposes of his father in terms of this promise from God. How about Joseph and Judah over Reuben? Reuben's the firstborn in the tribes. He's the firstborn. But he gets thrown off the firstborn position in terms of adopting the purposes of his father. Okay? You got to know a little bit. Let me share a little bit about Old Testament on this one too. Regarding Reuben, now remember we looked at Genesis 49 where his father Israel is giving these prophetic announcements about where his sons are going to be. I didn't read the whole thing. He says, okay, Reuben, you're my firstborn. You're preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. That's the classic idea of what a firstborn is. But then if you read the next verse, but you are as unstable as water. So you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, you defiled it, and he went up to my couch. He slept with his dad's concubine, the firstborn Reuben. And so because of that, he was not going to be the firstborn, because he wasn't really fully embodying the purposes of his father. He was being a jerk. Even though he's the firstborn, he's not going to be the firstborn. This is spelled out for us really clearly when you go to this passage. 1 Chronicles 5, it's much later, and they're just listing the kids of the 12 tribes, the 12 sons. And he starts off with this: the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, well, the one born first in Israel. Look what he says. There's a parenthetical thought. He was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright, that's the promises to the firstborn, was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. He blew it. He was the born first, but he didn't end up being the firstborn. And then he makes an interesting comment. Even though Judah, who's the fourth in line, fourth oldest, even though Judah became strong among his brothers and a chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. Well, who was the chief that came from Judah? David. And eventually the Messiah, Jesus. It came through Judah. So what the writer of Chronicles is saying here is, look, Reuben blew it. He was born first. But because of what he did, he's no longer the firstborn. See how the firstborn title can move based on how you embody the purposes of the Father? He's not being the first, but then he goes on and says, but if I was going to choose who should be the firstborn, I would go to Judah, because Judah has David and power and might. In the southern kingdom, it was dominant. I mean, wow, it should be Judah. It should be Judah. But he says, no, it wasn't Judah. Actually, it was Joseph, second to youngest. So again, the double portion of inheritance goes to his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they get 2 large pieces of land, twice as much as any of the sons of Israel. So that's what you see. But here's the idea. Now, don't forget this. The whole tradition of what a firstborn is was based on who was born first and the honor that goes to them. But in God's economy, he doesn't care what your birth order is. You can be his firstborn if you're wholly given to his purposes and embodying them. That's why he calls all of us in Revelation the gathering of the firstborn. It really talks about a totality of being given over to the purposes of the Father. That's really all it is. And that comes out of the ancient tradition of firstborns. But God says that may be the tradition, and because of the tradition of the ancient lands, you understand all that kind of stuff. But let me tell you, I don't care if you're born first or last in my kingdom. If you embody my purposes wholly, I'm going to call you a firstborn. And that's exactly what he does right here. Now, in Jacob's line, Jacob has Reuben first. Reuben sleeps with his dad's concubine. He's off the list. Next in line are Simeon and Levi. Okay, second and third were Simeon and Levi end up doing some of the most atrocious, angry violence in the entire Old Testament. I mean, they should never make this into a movie because the screen would be red. It's just horrible what they did. So basically, you skip over the next two guys, Simeon and Levi, and then you get to the fourth guy, Judah. Well, that would seem like he would be a good pick for embodying the Father, and even the writer of Chronicles says that very thing. But there's something curious about Judah, and I would direct you again to the end of Genesis where you see Israel doing his prophetic statements over his sons. Read what he says about Judah. It's very interesting and very odd because when he talks about Judah, he doesn't talk about him as a firstborn son. He talks about him as a king of the universe. That's where Jesus comes from, through Judah. But still, the inheritance of the firstborn goes past him down to Joseph and his two sons. And why? Well, because Joseph fully embodied the purposes of his father when he was a magistrate in Egypt. And because of what he did, he acted like the Messiah, Jesus. He acted like God in terms of saving people who didn't deserve saving. So the whole idea of that goes to Joseph. And again, to see that in the flesh, look at the two pieces of ground that were given to Manasseh and Ephraim. Speaking of Manasseh and Ephraim, who was the oldest between Ephraim and Manasseh? Manasseh was. But when you see Israel blessing Joseph's kids, Manasseh and Ephraim, he puts his hand on each one of the kids' heads. He blesses them. Well, your right hand is the hand of preference. And he changes his right hand of preference from the older Manasseh to the younger Ephraim, and he does this. Remember that scene? He does it. And then Joseph gets really bent out of shape. No, Dad, that's wrong. Manasseh's the older one. You're doing this backwards. You shouldn't be giving your blessing to the younger one. That's not, we don't do it that way here. And Israel stops and says, hey. But that's not in the Bible. That's what I see. But he said, hey, stop it. I'm doing this on purpose. Because Ephraim, the younger, is going to have predominance over Manasseh. And when you look at the nations of Israel after that, Ephraim ends up being a very populated, dominant tribe in the north. I mean, really, really so. So anyway, so God switches it again. And everyone who's used to the entire ancient tradition of the firstborn gets bent out of shape, including Joseph. Wait a second, right? So it's kind of, who else is like that? Who's older, Moses or Aaron? Aaron is. Aaron is. And yet God goes to Moses to have him be instrumental in bringing the people out. Not Aaron. Aaron is actually subservient to Moses. Remember that whole conversation Moses has with God when God says, you need to go back in Egypt, talk to Pharaoh. And Moses says, I can't talk, can't do this. Sorry. I'm going to go back to the sheep. And God says, well, if I was God, I would have said, you wimp. But he basically says, okay. You say you can't speak. You've got a brother Aaron. I'll have him do that for you. And so Aaron goes subservient to Moses, who's leading this entire charge. Between the two of those, if you looked at them and stood them side by side, who looks like the traditional firstborn? Moses does. And yet God decides to turn the tables and say, he's the firstborn, but he wasn't born first. Because Moses, he knew, would perfectly embody the purposes of God, where Aaron wouldn't. See, it's fascinating. God loves turning the tables. Are there more? Well, they're everywhere. We already talked about David over his brothers, and then even after David, Solomon over the old Adonijah, and it goes on and on. I even left out, who were the kids of Abraham? Ishmael and Isaac. Which one's the older? Ishmael. Who served as the firstborn for God? Isaac. Firstborn is not always the one that's born first. So this is not just anecdotal. This is the entire Old Testament. God is taking this entire table and flipping it upside down routinely so that every time it happens, every ancient reader of this will say, wait, that's just not right. The honor goes to the firstborn, and God's not following the game plan. That's why this is worthy of a saga. Every time it gets turned upside down, it turns into a saga because it violates all the ancient mores. We all understand what firstborns are all about, but God's not playing by the rules. He's not honoring those who were born first, but he is honoring those who are wholly given to the purposes of God. So firstborn is a title that has, in God's respect, nothing to do with your birth order, everything to do with what you're wholly given to in terms of serving God. That's the firstborn. So again, when you look at Jesus, was he wholly given over to the purposes of the Father? Yes. So when we call him firstborn, we're not just saying in some sense, like false religions will say, that he's the firstborn of all of us. We're all basically the same species. He's just the one that was born first, and I'm number 1,400,000,000, whatever, a million. No. We're talking about the fact that he is the perfect embodiment of the purposes of the Father. And since he is the firstborn of the dead, he's the one who's the perfect embodiment of the Father's will and purpose for those of us who are dead in our sins. It says so much. You got to get your arms around firstborn because it says so much, and yet we miss it because we're not Old Testament scholars. That's why I actually stole this phrase from this commentator of the Old Testament, C.H. Gordon. He says, every time God flips the table, the story is worthy of a saga, because God is no respecter of your birth order, but he is a respecter of what you wholly give yourselves to. There's great theology in that. Because those who are naturally born into God's family, that is, the Jews, may not actually be Jews. And Paul says that explicitly in Romans. Not everyone who's a Jew is a Jew, in terms of that. That's it. You will see this theme, this meme, everywhere because it's built into the Old Testament and then carried over to explain in the New Testament who Jesus is. Because he is the perfect example of the firstborn. Perfect example. What do I got next? So that's that. Let me read you one more thing because I think we're going to sing after this. Well, let me tell you what we're going to do next week. This is part B of the firstborn. We're going to talk about the relationship between fathers and sons. Because you got to know that as well to couple that with the firstborn idea to get the full rich mountain of what this whole meme means. So we'll cover that second part next week. But you know most of it. You are scholars right now, so there you go. I'm going to read you one more verse before we sing because, frankly, I forgot about this and woke up last night and it was talking in my head. In Zechariah 12, there's a very famous passage in Zechariah 12 that talks about the fact that at the end of time, the Jews who have ignored Jesus will realize that they made a big error and they'll come back to him. And they'll be mourning because of that. But I want you to hear the language because now that you are Old Testament scholars on firstborns and you know that Jesus is a firstborn because he's a perfect embodiment of the purpose of the Father, listen to this. This is God saying, now this is still future to come, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. They'll suddenly realize that Jesus fully embodied the purposes of the Father, and they killed him. Zechariah 12:10. This is the only Hebrew that I know because it's in a song that we play all the time. V'shevachtia bet David and v'al Yoshev Yerushalayim ruachen v'tai hanunim v'hibitu elai et asher dakaru, whom he pierced. So this is a passage that says that one day the Jews will know that the one whom they pierced was the Father's firstborn. And that'll be a sobering sight, and they'll mourn for him because of that. The firstborn is the perfect embodiment of the purpose and power of the Father, embodied in the flesh, and represents the Father without any differentiation from the Father's will or his purpose or anything. This is why Jesus, when you see him in the New Testament, says, listen, everything the Father said, that's what I'm saying. Everything the Father does, that's what I'm doing. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The perfect embodiment of the purposes of the Father. That's the firstborn, with great honor and great dignity. Okay, next week, sons and fathers, and we'll get even a better fine tune on that as we put that into the mix. And then you'll be perfect Old Testament scholars on firstborns and sons and fathers. Okay, let's pray. Father in heaven, our hearts direct back to Jesus when we read these things. That he was exactly the perfect embodiment of your will and your purpose. And Lord, we are amazed in a way too that when we look forward into Revelation, that we find ourselves to be those who are called as firstborn as well. And in Hebrews, that's what we're called. That somehow, in a sense, we're firstborns as well. That honor and that dignity that should be given to one is given to all, in a sense. Because you're the one who's been changing our heart. You're the one that's been slowly making our heart's desires more wholly yours to represent you more wholly and more perfectly. You do through us in what I think is kind of a flawed way, and yet still you do it through us. You represent who you are. And there's so much of who we are in the places you place us that reflect who you are and represent your purposes for the people that we run into. So thank you for all that you do in and through us, and our hearts go back in praise to this one who is the firstborn of all creation, the firstborn of the dead, the firstborn who is indeed the one who is preeminent in all things and who embodied the perfect and full will of the Father for the benefit of those of us who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. That's the firstborn. So we thank you for him, and we thank you what you do in our lives, and we thank you that you champion us out of darkness and into the kingdom of your dear Son. So thank you for all this in Jesus' name. Amen.